Hey guys, Poro here with another Worlds 2025 team breakdown, this time for Fnatic from the LEC. If you had asked me prior to Split 3 playoffs if I thought Fnatic would make Worlds, I would have definitely said no. The team's core have been disappointing on different rosters over the years, and while they had some good regular season performances, they would always drop off come playoffs. In the LEC, this year has been dominated primarily by three teams, those being G2, MKOI, and KC. The year started off with a single round robin, and all three of those teams finished with a tied 6-3 scoreline. Above them was Fnatic at 8-1, who kept their longtime topside core of Oscarinin, Razork, and Humanoid, and got a new bot lane for the year in Upset and Mickey. With this dominant regular season showing, they came in as the favorites and the 1 seed, but came up short finishing just 3rd as KC would go on to win and G2 would come in 2nd. This didn't come as a surprise though, as Fnatic's topside core had also spent multiple regular seasons prior finishing either 1st or 2nd, only to fail in playoffs and not be able to win. Fnatic tried to run it back in spring and would finish regular season 7-2 in 2nd place, but would again underachieve in playoffs finishing 4th after being swept by KC, who would finish 3rd as G2 were the runner-ups and MKOI were the champions. With history repeating itself for years, Fnatic decided to make the call to finally let go one of their new age franchise players, and they benched Humanoid. This wasn't all that shocking, as keeping Humanoid had become increasingly more controversial with every passing split, and a change was welcome. The player they picked though was unexpected, as they went with T1's Challengers mid laner Poby, who I'll talk about later. With this change, Fnatic looked to be more of the same heading into playoffs as the 4th best record this time around. In the 3rd-4th place match to decide who would qualify for Worlds, they would once again be placed against KC, who had knocked them out in winter and spring, and most people thought KC would easily slide their way into the world spot. This time though, it would be different, as we saw Fnatic find a form we hadn't seen in a long time as they dispatched KC. I was very surprised when watching this series live, and to find out why, let's take a look at the teams and players. Oscarinin is a very interesting player to me. I remember when he first came into the league, as it was one of the weirdest seasons for a rookie ever. He came in for the 2023 spring season, and the signing was pretty controversial at the time as he was replacing Wunder, who is widely regarded as one of, if not the best EU top laners of all time. The next 3 weeks would bring us some of the craziest whiplash ever. In week 1, Fnatic would drop all 3 of their games against mid-tier SK and Vitality, and dead last bottom-tier XL. In these 3 games, Oscar would drop horrendous performances that had the Fnatic fans screaming and yelling for him to be replaced right away. When I say these performances were bad, I'm talking like generationally bad games. Oscar would end week 1 with a scoreline of 0 kills, 18 deaths, and 4 assists. In week 2, Oscar would do okay, but nothing special. A bad 1-6 Jace game, a fine Jax game, and a solid Gangplank game. People were still skeptical of his signing, but it was definitely a way better look. Then, in week 3, Oscar would absolutely pop off. An 8-0 Olaf masterclass, an 8-3 carry job on Jax against G2, and finally a Jace loss against Astralis where the entire time his team was slacking, but he was attempting to 1v9 an unwinnable situation. In these 9 short games, Oscar went from a terrible bottom-tier last-place top laner to the best top laner in the league, and ever since then I've been very intrigued by him regardless of how badly his form dips. Bad form dips have in fact defined Oscar over the past couple years though, and I know a lot of people have expressed disappointment in his play and calling for him to be replaced. Deep down there though, it's clear that the talent is lurking. KC's top laner is Kana, a player from the LCK who has been on star-studded rosters and made deep runs at Worlds. This year, Kana has been considered by far the best top laner in the LEC, and he's been stomping and styling on basically everyone. When Fnatic met up against KC in playoffs, the sentiment was that Oscar would be the reason why Fnatic would lose, and his job was to attempt to hang around and not be too much of a liability. In that series, Oscar would play his best games of the entire year, solo killing Kana in practically every game regardless of the matchup. It was a complete takeover and a change we rarely ever see pro players at this level make in such a short period of time. Despite the entire year being relatively poor, this one series reminded me a lot of Oscar's week 3 during his debut split where he looked like the best top laner in EU with an endless amount of potential in him. Then he moved on to play MKOI and got gapped by Merwin, and Fnatic would go out in underwhelming fashion. But that's kind of just what you get from a player like Oscar. At Worlds, he will likely come in with the expectation of being a mid-tier top laner at best. Based on his year, we'll have to assume that he will be bottom half. But just like in 2023, that ceiling is there and you never know when it will come out. Watch out for Oscar. He might have 0 good performances and lose to everyone, but he also might just be the player who could randomly gap an Eastern top laner on short notice. Razork has been a Fnatic's jungler for 4 years now, and during his entire LEC career he's always been a jungler who is viewed as hovering around the top of the table, and yet never being able to get across the finish line and actually win. For most of his career he's been the same player. He's an aggressive jungler who is very good at getting his team leads, and loves to play with higher resources. In terms of EU, he's for sure one of the better early game players, and many of his wins are snowballing stomps. However, Razork also has a reputation for throwing a lot of games by playing too aggressive. It seemed like no matter how big his lead got, he always wanted to squeeze out an even bigger lead at all times until the point where he would inevitably take a step too far and give over a massive shutdown and tempo swing for the enemy team. This has always especially been a big problem against better teams internationally, or against the other top teams in EU, and it's a problem that it's felt like Fnatic have refused to address for 4 years of him playing there. If we take into account the entirety of his 2025, the assumption is that this is the same type of player he'll be at Worlds. However, much like Oscar, Razork randomly turned it around right when he needed to most, and the Razork I watched against KC was a completely different player. He was still generating good leads and making good early plays, but it also felt like he was measured in how he wanted to progress the game, and he was willing to drop camps or objectives if the fight looked bad. This is definitely something I've never seen from Razork before, and if it's going to become a trend, then it's definitely the biggest positive leap he's taken as a player in years. I can't even say he's regressed against Mkoy, because in reality, Mkoy kind of stomped Fnatic in early games, and Razork never had a chance to show if he was going to throw a lead or not. So my conclusion from all of this is that Razork will probably show up to Worlds the same way he's looked at every past international, that is to say, not very good, but there is still that faint glimmer of hope from the KC series that'll turn it around and the improvement is there. Fnatic's new mid laner this split is Poby, the T1 Challengers mid laner. I'll talk more about Poby later when I do the team breakdown, but for now I'll give some of the basics. When Fnatic decided they were going to sign Poby, I was actually very unimpressed by the decision. I thought benching Humanoid was correct, but thought there was no way Poby would be the solution. That's because I've seen Poby play a sizable amount of games in LCK. I don't hold his actual LCK losses against him. When Faker got temporarily sidelined in 2023, Poby had to step into a T1 with no sense of leadership without the GOAT, and the team would lose practically every match as none of the other star players looked like themselves at all. I think regardless of how well Poby played in those 18 games, there was nothing he was going to do to fix T1 slump. The thing that made me skeptical of Poby was watching him in LCK Challengers. I watched the entire 2024 for that roster, since I was curious to see how Reckless would look in the LCK, and I formed many opinions about Poby. He's a facilitating mid laner at heart, and his best champions were Orianna and Nico. He also piloted the meta AD mid laners like Yone and Tristana, but his best moments were definitely when he got those playmaking mids. Realistically, Poby was never any better than the 5th or 6th best mid laner in the LCK CL, which isn't bad by any means since it's still the LCK CL, but not a player I would think would be worth an import slot. So in terms of what to expect from Poby, he's going to be a playmaker who picks champs like Orianna and Galio, and he'll play to facilitate his teammates. Again, I'll talk more about Poby's fit on Fnatic has gone when I do the team portion of this video, but I'll give you a quick spoiler and say that the fit has been a lot better than I thought it would be. Upset is probably the most controversial bot laner in EU from a performance perspective. You have people who think he's the most skilled ADC EU has ever produced, and you have people who think he's a garbage player who doesn't deserve a spot in LEC at all. Let's start with the fans. If you think Upset is an extremely skilled player, it probably comes from his mechanics. Upset has been around for a while, and during that time he's garnered a reputation of rarely dying and never having bad individual games. If you're an Upset hater, the focus is probably on many of those low death games, and to looking closer at how Upset is doing in those games. Critics point out that Upset is often positioned too passively and plays to not die instead of playing to win fights. He got a lot of criticism for this, especially during his time with KC, and people love to point out his staggering 4 10th place finishes domestically. Regardless of which side of the fence you land on, Upset is still a player who many teams are interested in signing, and he's still got pretty good mechanics. I do think there's some truth to Upset's passive play, but I don't necessarily think it's a crippling detriment to every roster he joins. Instead, I would say Upset is a pretty low influence player who does well when his team is good and does nothing productive when his teams are bad. Fnatic this year have thrown most of their resources bot side, and their game plan is usually to get Upset ahead so he can carry teamfights. I think this is a pretty good use of the player, as he's consistent and reliable at playing out standard games. It's been one of his better years for sure, and I think he'll be fine at Worlds, but I'm also still not convinced he's actually one of the best bot laners in the region. The other half of the veteran duo Fnatic signed in the offseason is Mickey, and he's still the best support in the region in my opinion. Support has honestly been one of EU's better roles across the years, but despite that, Mickey has almost always been the consensus best performing support every split, and it's been this way for basically 6 years at this point. He's easily the greatest support the West has ever produced. The reason why Mickey has such a strong reputation is because in terms of creativity, he's either first or second depending on how big of a Hylissang fan you are. The angles Mickey finds to make plays rival the best the world has ever seen, and I have no doubt he could easily hold his own in an eastern region if he was ever sent there. Mickey's other big strength is that he's always trying to innovate and come up with new strategies and champions to stay one step ahead of the meta. In past years, he was going crazy with champions like Poppy before it was cool, Lissandra, and Soraka to name a few. This year, he's had good games on some unorthodox picks like Pyke and Taric. Whatever it is, when you have Mickey on your team, you can always be sure he's trying to think outside of the box both in draft and in game to get any advantage he can. This is also where Mickey can sometimes stumble though, as he's garnered a reputation as a bit of an inter. Sometimes in games he's thinking a little bit too much and he'll make a stupid looking play that results in his untimely demise. He's rarely ever making the game losing play or anything, but for every game winning play he makes, you can be sure to expect a stupid death or two alongside it. So to understand how Fnatic's chances look at this tournament, I want to revisit Fnatic's roster and compare it to how it was before to how it is now. Oscar, Razork, and Humanoid played together for almost 4 years, and this is virtually an unprecedented amount of time for a team to stick together, especially if they're losing. During their time together, Fnatic has always had the same problem, that being their mid and late games. Without fail, it felt like Fnatic would always throw their leads against better teams, and this ended up feeling like a huge limiter to Fnatic's ceiling. The more pressing issue though was that despite Fnatic having the exact same problem for years straight, they never showed any growth or any improvement at all. One of these glaring lack of improvements was in the mid-jungle department, as it felt like Razork and Humanoid never developed any synergy together at all. Both players would just do their own thing and try to carry independently from each other. One of those two players had to go, and that's what Fnatic also decided when Split 3 of this year rolled around. As mentioned before, they went with a player who I didn't think would be a good fit. Poby was never impressive in LCK CL to me, and his facilitating style felt more like a go-with-the-flow role player type of style, whereas it felt like Fnatic needed new life who would come in and change everything. So how did Poby do? In my opinion, Poby actually did not look any better in the LEC than he did in LCK CL. He was still the exact same player who would pick the same type of champion and be a role player, so in that regard I think I got it right. However, I completely underestimated what this type of player would do for Fnatic's lineup, and I think the change has been a huge net positive for the team. In T1, Poby's fit was honestly pretty bad in hindsight. Smash and Reckless were a strong lane, but the other roles left much to be desired. Guwan wasn't a carry jungler, and Dahl wasn't a reliable top laner, meaning that Poby's options of who to actually play for were limited and underwhelming. Poby was a facilitating mid laner on a team who needed another carry. On the flip side, Fnatic was a team who had no real carry identity. Razork is a high resource jungler, Humanoid is a high resource mid laner, and Upset is a high resource bot laner. The team never really meshed well together because it felt like they could never decide who to play for, and as a result, everyone thought it was their responsibility to win the game, and the coordination suffered. Fnatic is a team who had too many cooks in the kitchen essentially. Adding Poby to Fnatic was, stylistically, the perfect decision. A player like Poby works way better on Fnatic than it does on T1. Razork is quite frankly a much better jungler than Guwan, and this extra firepower in the jungle actually gave Poby a player who he could build real 2v2 synergy with. I think the Razork Poby mid-jungle has been a great fit, who matched way better than either of their previous partners. Poby also gave Fnatic a clear identity as he's someone who was willing to play for his teammates, meaning Upset was able to shoulder the primary carry responsibility in a much more controlled and structured way. The team just functions way better when everyone is on the same page, which is exactly what a role player can do for you. In turn, I think this also explains exactly how Fnatic were able to look like a completely different team against KC. They weren't making disastrous mid-game and late-game mistakes the way they used to, because for the first time in years, they actually had a clear and coordinated game plan for how they want to win the game. Razork doesn't have to feel like he needs to get Fnatic an infinite gold lead to win anymore, and that leads to him taking much less big risks. What I felt like when watching Fnatic beat KC, and even when I watched Fnatic lose to MKOI, is that for the first time in a long time, they actually felt like a real team. It doesn't matter that Poby might not have some crazy high ceiling, what mattered was that he was the missing piece of the puzzle to give Fnatic an identity. He was the perfect glue man for Fnatic's specific situation. So heading into Worlds, my expectation is that Fnatic probably won't actually do that well or anything. I doubt they'll make it out of Swiss, and they probably won't place any better than the older iterations of Fnatic placed. However, what I'll be looking for is how they lose. In the past 3 Worlds, Fnatic looked like a jumbled mess who would lose in the most uninspiring ways possible with no hope for improvement. That roster's ceiling was the 9th place finish they kept getting. This new Fnatic will also probably bow out in that 9th to 12th place range, but I think it'll look more like that was their floor instead of their ceiling, and I'm excited to see how 2026 will look if they keep their core together. That's all I have for you for this one. 12 down, 5 to go. I recently started a Patreon for people who want to support me more while I'm making these videos. I have 3 tiers, each with varying amounts of benefits including different types of behind-the-scenes content, and even a custom Poro drawing that I'll display in video outros. If that interests you, check out the Patreon link in the description. I'll see you all for the next one. Bye!